All right, cool. So we're recording now. I hope everyone had a good week off. I hope you found that time as a way to sort of spend some time making data sets. As I'm sure most of you are aware by now, this is like hands down the hardest part of anything in machine learning, right? Like getting all this data is really hard. It is very hard to sort of synthesize it or like scrape it or just like get it in a format that is you know, similar to each other. Like that's one of the hardest challenges, right? It's very easy to find lots of images. It's hard to like get them all aligned or put them in squares, like those sort of things. So, and if you haven't finished your data set, like don't worry. Training takes about a day. So I would say like maybe by the end of this week or by beginning of next week, like you should have your data set set up and ready to go so you can do some training. And then obviously you've got a week or two, just to play with things and generate some morphing and interpolations and that sort of thing. So, don't feel like you have to be ready to go immediately, but it is sort of helpful. And I'm also happy to help if people are still looking for a couple images or that sort of thing. Like I can help set up some scraping tools or whatever for folks. So, but yeah, hope you realize like this is really hard, and this is also like, you hear like I feel like it's not as popular these days. We hear a lot about people talking about big data. Like this is essentially like a big data problem, right? Like generating all these images is one thing, or like finding lots of images on the internet is one thing, but getting them all into like a shape or a form that you can use is actually like the biggest challenge. So cool. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick and just talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. All right, so just a reminder, today's class is really going to be mostly cover around how to do training. So we'll look at how to do training inside Runway. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things you might experience just that like work well or don't work well. And then we'll look very briefly at sort of like once we've got a model trained in Runway, how to use some of the internal tools inside Runway to do exports, to do some interpolations, like that sort of thing. Next week, we'll look at a lot more like sort of big fun things to do with it. We'll look at ways to sort of manipulate these things outside of Runway or like using Runway and another tool called P5JS. So we'll go through some interpolations with that and some other things. So the next 2 weeks will sort of be like mostly StyleGAN and really like focusing on sort of how to get the most out of these things. And then just a reminder, 2 weeks from today, we'll do a group share. Critique feels like the wrong word because it's just mostly like people sharing what they've made over the past 5 or 6 weeks. So I recommend like having some stuff to share to that. It doesn't, it's not like a final project sort of vibe where you need to have something finished and ready to go, but more just like come and just show some of the stuff you've made over the past couple weeks and talk about what worked and what didn't work and what you've learned, that sort of thing. So it should be pretty loose. Don't have any anxiety or anything about that. Just like share some of the stuff you've been making, just because I think everyone's like, especially because we're all in our homes over Zoom, like I think it's just a nice way to sort of like show what everyone's been making and just sort of be a little bit more of a community and that sort of thing. So today I'm going to do a really brief discussion about Runway plugins. Just because I need to cover, I want to cover them just so people are aware that exist, but it's a pretty brief thing. And then we'll talk, like I said, we'll mostly cover how to do training, and we'll cover over a little bit at the end on how to do interpolations. We'll mostly talk about like sort of what is StyleGAN, how does it work, and then we'll talk about how to train a model. So it'll be 90% of our day. So yeah. So before I talk about everyone's data sets, let me just cover the Runway plugin stuff really quickly. So Runway does have a series of plugins where you can essentially like use the Runway tools with other apps that you are probably like pretty familiar with. So there's two, I believe, I don't think they've updated this, but I think at the moment there are 2 official Runway plugins. One is for Unity and one is for Photoshop. I don't use Unity personally, so I can't really speak to that one as much. I do use Photoshop. I will say I don't really use the Photoshop plugin, but we'll talk about how to use it and how it works and that sort of thing. So if you are interested in it, you can try it out. I think I mentioned this before, but Runway has a Slack channel. And in the Slack channel, there's lots of like community folks who are creating their own tools and own plugins. So if you use anything like Grasshopper, which is like a 3D plugin, there's some other tools out there available for other applications. So if there's something that you're really into using, there might be a plugin already to utilize that. In addition to sort of these like applications that are tools and that sort of thing, there are lots of coding samples for other applications. So if you're a touch designer person or open frameworks or processing, there are code samples. I believe that is all on the Runway website. So again, if you know a little bit about coding, which I don't think this class is as much about, but if you are interested in that, there's also ways to tie those tools to Runway. And we'll look at, next week, we'll look at how to use p5.js to talk to Runway and those sort of things. So we'll cover some of this stuff again next week. We'll be looking at code, but like no one will have to edit code. Like I'll basically show you like the 5 lines of things you'll need to edit. So there will be no like coding part of this class to like force people into that world, because I know that always causes a little bit of anxiety. We will be using a coding interface, but it should be pretty painless. Basically, I'll be like, do this step, do this step, do this step, and then you'll be able to use it to generate sort of newer, more interesting ways of interacting with these different models. The key thing with all these plugins, which is the key thing about anything, is like you have to remember what the input of your model accepts as sort of the output of your data, right? So especially when using the Photoshop plugin, remember that Photoshop, basically the way the Photoshop plugin works is it takes a layer from your Photoshop file, sends it to Runway, and then Runway returns back what the output is of the model you've requested. So in this case, like it's really important to remember that whatever model you're using has to take an image as an input, right? Because Photoshop is only sending images over. So you can't use something like attention GAN, which is like you give it text and you get an image back. You'll need to use the Runway interface for that. So it's just important to remember that like your input outputs and like how those things work. So for example, you can use some like big ByGAN, and you can send the Photoshop layer to the big ByGAN model and you'll get an image back. So it's a little limiting in that respect because, you know, again, you sort of have to remember the input output, and like your input and your output have to be images, which is pretty limited in what actually exists in that world. But you can do it. So just be aware of that. So to get the Photoshop plugin, I actually have a video here that is linked to from here. I'm not going to cover the entire thing of this, but I recommend if you're interested in playing with the Photoshop plugin, there is a video here that you can watch and sort of play with. But essentially the process for the Photoshop plugin is you have to download it from the integration page, and there's a bunch of instructions here on like how to actually use it. So go there, you'll basically install the plugin. If you've installed like extensions or actions using like Photoshop before, it's pretty similar. And then you'll like launch Runway. So you actually launch Runway in this little like Photoshop window, and you have to pick what layer or what model you're working with from that interface. And then you have to turn on the model. So it's sort of similar to like how Runway works, because you're doing it all in Photoshop, which is a little interesting or weird. So it's also worth remembering that you have to send layers. So Photoshop sends a layer over to Runway. So it's not like you're sending the entire image, or it's not like you're sending your entire view over. So if you've got multiple layers going on, you have to like sort of copy those layers into one layer, compress it, and then send all those layers over to Photoshop at once. And they come back as a new layer. So it's also worth remembering that size is also a thing that is dependent there. So especially something like big ByGAN, which only returns a image at 256 by 256, you will get back a tiny little image. So if you send it a big Photoshop file that's high res, you're going to get back a little image as the response. So just beware of those things. It's like these are all early days of these tools, right? Lower your expectations, that sort of thing. So just remember that it's very apparent, like when you get back a little postage stamp in Photoshop, you're like, oh, that isn't very high resolution. So you can play with it in there. Let's see. So Steve asked, Photoshop layer of, yeah, so you could do a text layer, but those will be converted to images. So it's not like it's going to read that text. It's just going to like take it as a text image. And then, yeah, so it's still an image. It's not text. So there is a video here. I recommend if you're interested in playing with this, you can watch this. I mean, there's potentially a way to like turn this into an action or something in Photoshop, so you could almost batch stuff. I've actually never tried to do that before, but you could find it pretty interesting. Again, I don't personally play with it that much in Photoshop, but maybe if you've got like a really strong workflow that requires Photoshop or is something that you really like doing, you may find the Photoshop plugin helpful. And there are, like I said, other plugins as well that might also be a benefit for you if you work in a particular tool or something. Any questions about the plugins? Cool. So as I mentioned, like really short overview on this stuff. Steve, go for it.
Still costs money though, right? Because we're queuing Runway.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it still costs you the same amount of money that it does through other tools, which is like 5 cents a minute.
Right.
So when you turn on the model inside of Photoshop, that is turning on a model inside Runway, it is still charging you money. I do think there's something where like it turns off relatively quickly within Photoshop. So it's still like you send stuff over and it turns itself off like once it's finished, I think. So it's probably not saving you any money. It's just like it's not like it's being left on inside of Photoshop for hours at a time. So similar to how Runway works, it does turn off after a pretty brief period of inactivity.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Actually, one other thing I should mention, while we're sort of talking about stuff that is like not necessarily like super relevant to most of today's class, but Runway is also building out additional features that you might find useful. And for real, let me see. I'll just quickly sign in here. Tell I also took the week off. There we go. So there are a bunch of tools inside Runway that I think are starting to be pretty cool. So there's this new thing that's a video tool that does green screening. So if you have video that you want to like rotoscope and stuff, there's a really like, I actually think this tool is fairly nice in the sense that like you can, I'll just sort of show how this works really quickly, where you can just bring in a video and then you can like sort of auto mask away some of the feature and do some rotoscoping. So the way this works is you drag in a video. It's got to be a pretty short clip. I think it can do up to like 2 minutes, but I find that around 30 seconds is about good. So you might need to break it up into a bunch of pieces. From there, you can sort of pick regions. So you just sort of like click in the space and it sort of like figures out. Let's see if this works. See here, it's still generating my mask. So you'll see just by like clicking on that region, it picked out the mask pretty well. And then as you click around, it's sort of like figuring out exactly what the masking space is as well. And depending on the video you have, it can, you know, here it's like missing some areas, right? So I'll have to click include and then include those spaces again. And you'll see it like fix that mask. So they are adding these tools, and I tend to find they're adding more workflow tools right now, in part just because I think that's where a lot of the business is, where like people will use this. But this tool is actually free. So if you have an account, it's free. It is, I think it'll produce 640 by 640 video for free users, meaning if you're not paying for a creator plan. But if you do have a creator plan, which is like the $15 a month, it'll do HD video, which I think is up to like 1280 or something. So they are adding all these tools, and like this is sort of stuff outside of like just the traditional model stuff that we've mostly looked at. So there are some really cool examples, and they're building out a lot of this stuff. So if you're interested in video, this is a really good tool. And I actually say like I've tried out a lot of these tools from other people before, and I find this one to be like one of the better ones and one of the quicker ones. So you know, Runway, the Runway folks are constantly adding new stuff, and it's like I said, I think they're focusing mostly on workflow tools right now, just because again, it's sort of a new way to get more people to use this stuff. So it's a little less creative and more like purely workflow based, but it is really nice. So definitely like you'll see just like they're adding new things like every month or two that are worth playing with. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And I think the video tools thing is cool because it's a new pricing model for them. So you know, again, ways to like save yourself some money or like play with this stuff inside of Runway more. So there's also these quick actions, which I think I've maybe mentioned before. These are actually like the models. So you could actually find the model for this. The interface is slightly different in the sense that like it sort of like jumps you right into this interface where you can then upload images and do stuff. This charges not by the minute, but by how many images you're giving it. So we'll actually look at this at the end of class. There are ways to run your model outside of the like model workspace, where the pricing is more based on how many images you produce and less about how long you're running it for. So we'll look at this when we actually do StyleGAN, but if you want to produce something like 100 random images, it'll charge 1 cent per image rather than like 5 cents or like, yeah, rather than 5 cents per minute. So it's kind of a nice way to do some random exports, and there's some other ways that we can use this as well. So Runway has it's starting to become like more of a complicated pricing structure, which can be a little hard to track sometimes. I think it's mostly because they're experimenting with like what works best for people. But there are lots of different ways to sort of access these features, and some of them are less expensive than others. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and actually, you know what? Let's talk a little bit about what people have made as data sets. So I saw that there were a couple inside of the Slack channel. So maybe we can just sort of like, I'll just call in a couple of folks, and if they want to talk about what they're making, that would just be sort of helpful to hear. I know we talked about this a little bit before we started class, but yeah, it'd be cool just to sort of have people talk through what they're doing. We'll just go reverse order. Violet, do you want to talk about a little bit what you're making?
Sure, yeah. So I want to train a model to create unique Rorschach ink blots. So I'm making a data set right now with just like classic black and white ink blot shapes. I couldn't really find any Instagram accounts that I could scrape from. Maybe I just wasn't looking hard enough, but I ended up just doing everything manually, just like screenshotting things, like searching on Pinterest and just Googling things. I have about like 300 pictures right now. So I'm still working on it, and I'm struggling a little bit with like disparity in terms of quality of the image. Like there's some really, really low quality ones and some like higher quality ones. So I don't know how that's gonna pan out for the future. But yeah, it's just still working on it. But I'm excited about what it will hopefully do.
Cool. Yeah, I think it'll be fun to see it. I think it also will like those morphing will be kind of fun to see. I think like there's some of these things that like are just gonna be cool to just see static examples, and there are other ones that I think will like really perform well with some morphing or interpolation.
Yeah, I'm really excited to morph them.
Yeah, and I wouldn't worry too much about quality. Runway does a good job of sort of like massaging some of that away. And I like the one thing I would say for a lot of this stuff is like we're just like testing and trying things out. So if you find that you really like the model, you can always come back and sort of like add to it or clean up the data set a little bit more. So, you know, for this class in particular, like perfection is sort of the enemy of good. Just like getting stuff done and trying it is sort of the fun part. And then when you find something that works really well, you can always come back to it and just be like, okay, I'm going to make this like, I'm going to like beef this up and then find more images or update the quality of them and then try it again.
Cool. Good to know. I mentioned in like my DM to you, Derek, that I definitely wanted it to be mirrored in the output because all the inputs are pretty much symmetrical. Do you think that would happen? Like, would it recognize that pattern of mirroring?
Okay. Yeah, I tend to find that it does learn mirroring pretty well. Again, in the case of where like if you really like how the output is and you want to clean it up even more, what I might recommend is like bringing all the images into Photoshop and like doing a line in the middle of the image and making sure that the mirror is like perfectly aligned in the middle. If things are off just slightly, it'll like shift a little bit here and there. I don't think it's really going to affect like the output of the model, but it's like one of those things where like the I don't want to apply grades to this thing, but like the B version of a model versus the A+ version of a model is like the better your alignment is, like the more likely it is to really like pick up on that and that sort of thing. But I would sort of say like start by just testing it and trying it, and then if you really like it and you want to improve it, like those are some key things. So it's like image quality and alignment. Like if you improve those, you'll see like a marked improvement. But it's sort of like, well, do I want to spend 3 days doing that, or do I just want to try this and see how it goes, that sort of thing. Cool. Ryan, do you want to talk about what you're working on?
Yeah, I used the IG scrape on my Instagram account. I had about like I had about like 2,000 images, but I was really interested in just the risograph prints, and so I went through like kind of weeded it down to about I'm about like 420 images right now of these risograph prints, and some were like different orientations. So I want to make them all like vertical. Um, and they're all roughly like aligned in the same alignment, same size, and same alignment. You know, that's I mean, a question for you is like some are kind of off and kind of over. I think ideally I'd want the output to be like static images where it will just create its own like risograph like prints, hanging prints. And then I was gonna like print those up on my risograph and make a zine or something like that. Um, so I would like, you know, that border or the paper to be relatively the same across all the different output images. So, um, you know, I don't know how exact I have to be, but
Yeah, again, I think it's like I would start by just trying it out and seeing what happens. And then if you
sure.
like what you're seeing, the ways to improve it are to like align stuff a little bit better or like reshape things a little bit. Um, yeah, I think it's just like generally like start with what you got and then like figure out how it goes and then from there like update stuff.
Cool.
But yeah, I think this will be really cool. I'm really excited to sort of see what happens here. Um, and yeah, I think like you and I were just, I mentioned to you, like, I think it's cool to just do your own work, but I think it'd be fun
Yeah.
to then also do like other risographs that you like and like sort of like blend the two and like what happens when I have like an inspiration folder of things, like what gets generated then. So I think there's lots of
Cool.
opportunities there to sort of like make some cool stuff out of that.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm excited to see where it goes. So
Awesome.
yeah, cool.
Ellie, I think I just realized I skipped you. So if you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on.
No worries. I looked at New York Public Library digital archives a lot this week. There's a lot of cool stuff on there. But I definitely found that like Instagram was the easiest, kind of quickest place to scrape stuff from. There's a lot of really cool like archival accounts. One of my favorites is Scenic Simpsons, and there's like a lot of like cartoon accounts that you can find. Like I think there's like a Sailor Moon one too. They just like post screen grabs from the show. So yeah, I was kind of like with my own personal data set, it's definitely like could get very soupy. So I was interested in like maybe running the Scenic Simpsons one and seeing how that one turned out and kind of maybe giving me a clue of how my own would. Just because like I'm trying to make mine similar in like texture and color. They're all different photographs and scans from like a certain period of time. So yeah, I was hoping maybe that would give me a clue, but I also think it could be cool to see how it turns out. So yeah, that's what I've been working on.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, again, in terms of libraries, like I also think libraries have like really great data sets. The problem is like getting them downloaded or cleaning them up. Like one of the things that I tend to work a lot with is a library called the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is just like a repository of like old botany and old like science illustrations. But it takes a lot to clean those up, right? Like you download them and there's, 50 books of really cool illustrations, but there's a bunch of text in them. There's like other things you have to clean up. Most illustrations are not like perfectly aligned or other things, or some of the scans are weird. So yeah, like as I mentioned at the beginning of class, like data sets are hard. It's just like, we don't have the tooling to like make this stuff as easy as we would like it to. Like I spend most of my time making tools to like make this stuff slightly easier, and it's still really hard. Yeah, Instagram is very easy because it's just like you will find a person who has like a very weird sort of like, I love this topic, and like they've devoted an account to it. Scenic Simpsons looks cool because there's no people in it. So it's like, it'll be really interesting to sort of see how that one compares to that one that's in Runway already, right? The sort of like Simpsons face one. So really interesting to see how those two compare to each other. So definitely really interested in seeing that. And I think, your data set too, I think will be really interesting. I think I shared the show and tell from the last class. Watch it. I would recommend it. This reminds me, one of the students from that class took photos of like this warehouse party that him and his friends ran. So, you know, they always have like a photographer of those things and they post them or whatever. So he took all the photos from there and he posted it. And like, you get really like ghoulish, very creepy looking like people. And because again, like the people aren't always in the same position, but it's like the color of the photographs and like, you know, the space all looks the same. So you get this like very interesting where like you can, you know, if you've been at that place, you know exactly what it looks like. But the images themselves are sort of like all over the place, very kind of crazy and wild. And that's kind of the fun of these things. I think maybe Ellie, maybe you were talking about this, which is like, you want to evoke the memory of the place without it being like the representation of the actual place. And like, that was like very much the vibe of his project was like, you definitely got a sense of the people who went to these warehouse parties, the space, and like some of the, but it felt like very much like a distant memory sort of thing where like everything is sort of fuzzy and weird. Yeah, so like lots of cool opportunities to do that. And it's always just really about finding the data set and like getting it put together and then running it. So yeah. John, what are you working on?
So I'm still kind of working on two different things, but what I have at the moment is I dug through the Met Museum archive and thank you, Derek, for helping, but I think you were way above my head with your suggestions and how to scrape those things. So I ended up pulling them manually. Anyway, there are a bunch of like head and bust sculptures on pedestals and those kinds of things. And I guess I have around 600 images that I pulled. They're kind of interesting because I'd say about half of them are consistent. They're like these shots and they're on a gray background and everything's very similar. And the other good thing is like they shoot these things from different angles. So you can get each one has maybe about 5 angles and you see it from the back too, which is really kind of cool. So I'm sort of interested in how these things will kind of merge into some other kind of form or something. I guess that's what I'm kind of looking at because I have a little bit of interest in sort of plaster casting and things like that. You know, the other half of the images are, you know, there's some that are in black and white, there's some that are on white backgrounds and some that are on black backgrounds. So I'm not sure how much this is all going to affect things or whether I start thinking about it in terms of just being like these sort of flat things that kind of, you know, become something else. But I was able to, you know, I have them all set up and, you know, I just kind of ran them through a script through Photoshop and they're all, you know, in the same size and everything. But you know, some of them are more vertical than others, so there's different widths and how they fit on the background. So I don't know if that's going to be a problem or not. The other thing was this book cover archive that I been trying to access, and it seems to be going up and down. And I do, looking at them again though, I do sort of think, you know, to me I think, oh, they're all book covers, but when you look at them, they're all like, oh, this is like 1,000 completely different images. And I don't know how that would kind of work together, but I'm still kind of interested in seeing if I can figure out if I can easily kind of get this together. I might see what I can do with that too. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, I think the funny thing is always, yeah, like we as humans think about a data set very differently than like a machine thinks about a data set, right? Like you think about a book covers and you're like, oh, this is 1,000 book covers. Like that's a cool concept. But yeah, you're right. Like the machine will be like, but some of these are illustrated. Some of these are photographs. Some of these are, you know, various colors or more type or more image, like those sort of things. So yeah, it's like, it's kind of an interesting way to rethink it. And also I'd say like with this group, especially like, we're all like pretty interested in more experimental stuff. So I think it's always fun to be like, okay, what do I want to do with like that's more realistic, which maybe is the busts. And then like, what's the more experimental or like weirder stuff I'm going to get, which would maybe be the book covers. I tend to teach these classes sometimes with people outside of SSHH, and a lot of them are really focused on realism, which means like you have to find like really well aligned stuff and really like, you know, perfectly manicured data sets, which can be a lot harder. Whereas I feel like this group is way more just like, I'm just going to throw it at it and see what I get back. And maybe it'll be cool, maybe it won't be, which I like because like that's also how I approach it. So yeah, it's definitely just like, it gets kind of addicting. Like once you train your first model, you'll be like, oh, I can just keep doing this. Like, this is cool. Like I'll just keep throwing it more data. So yeah, I would say like, just start and just play with it and see what happens. Steve, I know you've been switching away on some data sets, so.
I'm going crazy. Yeah, I drew 1,000 drawings in. I gave myself like a rule set to use one particular like flat tool and not include any like mark making in the images that I created, and just set forth and made 1,000 like compositions. And so I see them as like outlines to 3D sculptures that can be created afterwards. So I think I'm really hoping that StyleGAN can kind of chew through all of the colors, the way the shapes are made, and how they kind of like edge on each other, and then take all of that information and give me new sculptures and sculptures that can morph. And so I think the digital piece of like the sculptures morphing through P5JS would be really cool just as like a visual thing. But then I think as a tool, I'm really interested to see how StyleGAN can then inform creations of like new visual structures that I can then build in the physical space as well.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome. All right, awesome. It sounds like we've got some really cool data sets. I'm really excited to sort of see. It also sounds like we've got some nice diversity, so it's going to be kind of fun to see what everybody makes. Cool. So let's start talking a little bit just about how StyleGAN works, about how GANs work in general, and then we'll sort of pick up how to exactly use Runway by itself. Okay, so I've talked a lot about StyleGAN, and we've talked about big GAN and attention GAN, and you might at this point be wondering what the heck is a GAN. This thing just keeps coming up. So GANs are a particular subset of machine learning. They stand for Generative Adversarial Network, which I will talk about what those, well, we know what a network is, right? A network is essentially the model that we're training on. So we'll talk about generative and adversarial in a second. But GAN tends to be just a big category of things. There are many different types of GANs, and really it's just a category of how things train. So basically the way that a GAN works is a GAN is technically two machine learning models. So there's one machine learning model that is called the generator. That is what generates our images. And then there is a second machine learning model that's called the discriminator. And what the discriminator does is it tries to figure out if the generating model, the images you're generating, are real or not. So essentially this is sort of a adversarial game. It is a game where these two models play off each other. And the very common way that you can think about this is like the generator generates an image and it says, hey, this is a real image, I swear it is. And the discriminator says, no, that's fake or that's real. And based on the response, so basically say like I give it a fake image that is clearly fake, and the discriminator is like fooled or whatever and says, yes, this looks real. Then we say, hey, based on this game, the discriminator got the answer wrong and we need to make the discriminator smarter. Or in the case of, the discriminator saying like, hey, this isn't a real image, then we need to make the generator smarter. So it's sort of this game of where they like slowly like get leveled up on both sides. And that's sort of the learning process. That's what we do during training. The most common way you'll hear people talk about this is sort of a game of forgery, right? So this is a game between a banknote forger and a bank. And you start by like, the forger starts by drawing really, really poor versions of dollar bills, takes them to the bank, and the bank cashier says, hey, this is not a real dollar bill. Like, in this world, there's no like cops or anything where you get busted or whatever, but like, just sort of like go back and like learn how to make a better dollar bill, right? And at some point, like both these things start off pretty stupid, I guess is what just the flat way of saying it. They both start off pretty stupid. But because we sort of, the model knows which images are fake and which images are real, over time, they both get smarter. So you can start with a dollar bill that looks like this. The discriminator at some point says, yeah, this looks like a dollar bill to me because of these shapes, or like, it has text and then there's a bald guy in the middle, like this looks like a dollar bill to me. And then over time, the discriminator learns like, oh, dollar bills need to be green. So like I should start to see green or other colors, or like maybe the bald guy is no longer center, but off center because these are American dollar bills or whatever, until it gets to like a point of like, oh, well now I shouldn't see flat shapes. I should see shading or that sort of thing. So it gets to a point where like, it'll never get to that point of where it's like really, really good, right? Where it's like perfect. But it does get to a point where like, it's approximate enough that if like, a human were to even be flashed an image, you might say like, oh, that's real. So that's basically the process of how a GAN works. So every GAN uses a similar like adversarial process. Different models use different constructions of these things. StyleGAN is pretty straightforward in that there's just like a single generator and a single discriminator. Horses to zebras, which we've talked about before, actually uses 2 generators and 2 discriminators to do this like thing that's called cyclical GANs. We won't talk about that here because you can't even train one inside Runway, but just know that there are different versions of GANs, but the general idea is just that there's this adversarial process going on to sort of like train these models. So training inside Runway. So you can train these models outside Runway. Runway just happens to make it really nice and is a GUI. Some of the positives of using Runway is obviously you have a GUI, like you don't need to set up your own server or that sort of thing. Runway has a nice like visual interface. You can sort of watch it training over time, which is pretty nice. It's fairly fast. I won't say it's the fastest out there now. There are some newer versions out there that are a little bit faster. Runway always a little bit lags behind sort of like what's available in the world, just because of they have to build their own infrastructure, that sort of thing. But it's still pretty fast. So we'll be able to do, a decent training in like 8 hours, which is pretty good. We'll talk a little bit about training time and how that affects the model and that sort of thing. But yeah, Runway's decent. The price is about what you would expect to pay based on another server. It's probably a little bit more expensive just because Runway is a company and they're adding a little bit of fees on top of stuff just to run their business. So we'll talk about, I think most of the trainings that we'll run in this class will generally be about $30 to $50. So you've got $100 in credits. So you should be able to do at least a training or two. And we'll talk about how those trainings are affected by time and that sort of thing. But know that like just with the credits you have for this class, you should be able to do a couple trainings. We'll talk about this as we finish up these models, but I do recommend that you download your model once it's sort of like done. Just again, with startups, you never know. Like I know Runway is pretty stable and I don't expect them to go out of business tomorrow, but I think it's always worthwhile to download your files and just keep them as on your own once you finish them, especially when you spend a decent amount of money doing a training. So we'll talk about how to do that and what to do with that. I won't cover it in this class, but you can take those model files and use other tools out there in the world to do even more with your StyleGAN models. So I've got videos if anyone's interested in doing more of that. There are ways to do more with this, mostly using tools like Colab or other servers. There aren't as nice of GUI interfaces for other things outside of Runway, but if you are interested in sort of like what else can I do with this model now that I've trained it, I have some videos on that as well. So 2 things to know about the cost. At this point, I've gotten, the folks at Runway have given all of you a free training session. So we'll talk about what a free training session is. It's 3,000 steps. We'll talk about steps in a minute. That will be free, and you'll be able to train a model for 3,000 steps, which is decent. Again, I'll talk about that in a minute. If you want to do more training, so unfortunately, like I've said, you've got $100, but technically you've got $100, but like you can't use it just yet on training. Once you finish up your free training session, to do other training sessions, you need to buy a creator plan, which is $15 a month. So what I would say is like, maybe what you want to do is like, once you do your first test and you like it, maybe you want to go and build up a couple more data sets and then spend your $15 a month. Like you can auto cancel or cancel whatever after a month. So maybe you just want to buy a single month of time, do some training on it, and then like cancel your subscription if you decide you don't want to go forward with it. Once you have a creator plan, then your cost is ½ cent per step. And this is where it sort of ends up being about $30 to $50 per model training, depending on what you're doing. So obviously, like what's 3,000 steps times 0.05 or 0. So it's $15. So you're getting $15 in free training, essentially. I generally recommend that folks train for about 5,000 to 6,000 steps. So that's about $30. So again, we'll cover this all in just a minute, but just know that like once you've paid that extra $15, which unfortunately I can't gift people subscriptions because it is a recurring plan. So, if anyone is like, if $15 is an issue for folks, like, please let me know. I have some credits. I can also do like a training for you if you want to do a second one. Yeah, it's like kind of one of the hiccups with this class, but in general, like I would probably recommend just paying the $15 once you feel comfortable, then doing all your training and then just stopping it. They're good folks. They're not like, I think you can just cancel directly from their interface. So there's no like oh, you have to call us or like do other like shade. There's no like black hat shady stuff here. They want you to enjoy using the tool and they want you to come back. So you can do that. There is also like an annual plan, which I think saves you some like 10 or 20 bucks. So if you like realize you really like this and want to play with it way more, you can, it's like ends up being like $150 for the year or something. But yeah, just a little hiccup there with pricing, just be aware of. So there's a video here that covers all the training. We're going to do it live in class and like go over it together. But there's just a whole video here that just covers the individual training. If you want to just watch that at a later date, or if you want to come back, like basically like this will cover just the steps of training. Whereas what we'll do in class is I'll like go through the steps, but at every step I'll like stop and explain what's going on, as well as like things to be aware of, like what else you should know about, those sort of things. So this will be the quick video if you just want like to remember the steps. And then the class video will sort of cover like what's actually happening here, or like what should I be picking from these options. So the basic process for doing a training is you're going to upload your data set. You're going to do any pre-processing. Most of you, it sounds like, have already done your pre-processing outside Runway. There are some pre-processing tools inside Runway, which we'll look at very briefly. They're not the best. They just basically give you some options on like how to crop images or how to resize images. But you can do that pre-processing in there. Once you've finished your pre-processing, which basically means your data set is ready to go, you're going to pick a transfer model. We'll talk about a lot more about what that means in a couple minutes. But essentially, transfer models mean that you are transferring. It basically is a way to save you time. So transferring gets like into a really complicated area, but essentially one of the tricks of doing these sort of models is to pick from a model that's already been trained and then add your model on top of it. So what we'll look at is we'll look at how you go about doing that. Most of you will be picking the model that is the faces model, just basically like it's the highest resolution. So one thing to know about transferring is that you can only transfer, or like the size, whatever you transfer from is the size you're locked into. So we'll probably be doing like I said, with the 1024 model, we'll probably be doing transferring off of faces, which will then give us 1024 by 1024. If you have a smaller data set of like 256 or 512 or whatever, there are some other options within inside of Runway. We'll cover this a little bit more in just a minute. But this is one of the things that I disagree with the way that Runway approaches it. Runway tells you to like pick whatever is closest to your data set in terms of like, oh, if you're doing smiley faces, pick the faces data set. If you're doing, I don't know, something else that is more animal-like, pick the cats data set. In my experience, that will save you like an hour of time, but it severely limits you in terms of resolution, right? And in my experience as artists, we want the best resolution we can. So we want to spend that extra hour of training time or that extra $5 of training time just getting higher resolution. So we'll talk about that. I'll show you how to do that. But in my experience, pick a transfer model based on resolution, which 9 times out of 10 will be the faces model for your first time. Now, you can eventually transfer off of your own models, and I'll show you how to do that as well. But if you want to like pick up from a previous training, you'll also transfer off of old models, which is a possibility as well. You're going to choose your training length. That is how many steps you train for. We'll talk about steps and all that stuff in a minute. But basically, you have to pick it beforehand. And if you train it for a short period of time and then you want to train it for longer, you'll do this transfer model technique. So you'll basically like transfer off of a previous model you've already trained for a longer period of time. Then you'll do this whole training process. I'll show some examples of sort of what happens during a training process, and then you'll sort of like check in on it every now and then. The cool thing with this is like you can quit Runway, shut your laptop, do whatever while it's training, and behind the scenes it just trains for as long as you've set it to. When it is done, it will just stop and you won't be charged anymore. So you sort of set the length of time and it just runs behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about that. And then once you have your model, you'll go ahead and like have some fun and make some test images and that sort of thing. All right. So why don't we do this? So let me just get started. Let's see, what time do we have here? Actually, this is a great point for us to take a break. So why don't we do this? So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back at 5 till. And then I'll just sort of start walking us through the process. And while we walk through the process, I'll jump between slides and other things as well. So I'll see everyone at 5 till. How does that sound? Cool? All right, see everybody in 5 minutes. All right, so to start our training, The first thing you're going to do is you're going to open up Runway, which I guess is usually going to open to home. To find the training section, you'll go to the sidebar here and go to train. So you'll click on.
You're not sharing screen yet.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Cool. All right, so now I'm showing my screen, right? Okay, great. So along the sidebar, when you open Runway for the first time, it'll probably be at the home page like this. You'll come down here to the bottom and it'll say train. You click on train. There are currently 3 options within training inside Runway. There is an image generation, which is StyleGAN. We're going to use that one today. There's also a text training and object detection training. If you're interested in this, I have a demo on how to do object detection. Probably not super worthwhile for this class, but if you're interested, I have it there. And Runway has an example on training text. So if you're interested in any of those, you can do that. So basically, you'll pick one of these. You're just going to click on image. And you're going to need to give your training a name. So I'm actually going to give this a name of birds. I've got a data set that I'm churning out right now that is all about birds. So go ahead and hit create. That is going to pop up this experience, which says you need to select a data set. You'll see here, I already have many data sets already uploaded. What you will likely see is the mountains, airplanes, graffiti, forests, skyscrapers, caterpillars, and nebulas. These are pre-generated data sets if you just want to do a training off of one of those. So you won't want one of those. You'll probably want to upload your own data set. What I recommend doing for that is just grabbing your data set. So I've got one over here. Let's see what I'm at. I'm at 100. Let's just go ahead and zip this up and we'll just work with this. Actually, is that done? Oh, interesting. It is done. Okay, so there's only 100 images in here. So one thing to note is I recommend that you, before you upload your data set, you convert your images to JPEGs using like the highest quality JPEG setting. That's maybe counterintuitive if you're used to like working with PNGs and know that there's no compression on them. I personally find that like the compression level doesn't matter too much on these images, but what it does matter is it makes uploading a lot quicker. So you can upload PNGs. I think there's a minute or a maximum of like 10 gigabytes per upload. So if you do want to like, really max out PNGs and you've got time to wait, you can do that. But it will take a lot longer to upload PNGs. So you're just going to click here on upload your data set. You're going to go to your model or to wherever your data set is. So mine happens to be over here. And then you're just going to go ahead and pick your images. You know what? I'm actually going to, no, because those are all PNGs. Let's do this anyway. So I believe you can just pick the folder. Yeah, actually you have to pick a folder. So it's not worth compressing to a zip. Just pick the folder and then hit open. And this will upload. This will upload pretty quickly. You'll see there's 100 JPEGs, so this is happening pretty quickly. While this uploads, I'm going to go ahead and just sort of show some of the pre-processing tools in other data sets. So like, for example, I've got this other one here, which is all cat images. And I can go ahead and click on this. And then over here on the right-hand side, you'll see pre-process. So options for pre-processing are pretty limited. What this does is it opens an interface of like all of your uncropped images. So if you wanted to, I don't know, for whatever reason, if you didn't have Photoshop and you wanted to go ahead and crop your own images, you could go in here and click your own image and it loads up. Well, what's going on there? And then you can pick different types of cropping. So if you want to do your own sort of crop, I believe you can just like click on an image and you can just draw a crop. Now, what's worth remembering here is that you've got sort of different sizes here. So, you are cropping in on an image, which means to make it smaller. There are other tools here, like if you want to random crop, it'll just pick. Oh, I guess it's like you sort of have to pick this and then click check, and that's going to do a random crop. You can do a center crop. So if you have a rectangular image, I don't know if I have any here. Let's see. Yeah, I don't think I have any rectangles here. But if you had a rectangle, you could pick center crop and it's going to automatically crop it. Now, this is if you want to go through one by one and pick all of these inside of Runway. You don't have to. There's also this auto crop feature, which I find works sometimes and sometimes not that well. And this will do like an automatic, like it'll try to guess what the best crop is for an image, which sometimes work well, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it throws an error. Let's see, what do we get here? Yeah, so it like zoomed in a little bit. Again, just remember that these are changing the resolution of your images, so it might not work depending on what you want. Once you've gotten a crop you like, you can go ahead and just click the check button. It adds all the crops. You can also add multiple images at any time. So you can grab a whole set of these, or actually, I guess you just click all these here. And if you wanted to just do random croppings of these, you could just click random crop. And then you just, what's going on here? Oh, it's processing. So as you can tell, I don't use these tools very often. I'm mostly doing cropping outside Runway. And then whatever I upload to Runway is actually the data set that I want to use. You may find this is helpful, you may not. It just sort of depends on like what you're up to and what you're doing. So just know these exist. And then once you've done this, you can just hit submit, and these will all be like bundled up into a new data set. So up to you if you want to use those tools. That's pretty much it. Like that's literally it for the pre-processing. Is like you can either make your own crop, you can do a random crop, or you can like use their auto crop feature, which maybe is helpful, maybe not. One thing to note about the auto crop feature is I think it still makes rectangles sometimes, which even though it makes a rectangular crop, it's still going to be a square output. So like it's a little funky. Just be aware of that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Hey, Chris. No worries. We're doing a recording, so you'll get the recording. And we actually just started going through the process of doing this, so you should be fine. Cool. So this is like, it's now pre-processing that data set into like a new set, but my birds did upload. So if I wanted to go ahead and pre-process these, I could. I'll just use this as a way to sort of show you what these look like. Apparently there's only 100 in here, so we're going to see what a very small data set does in terms of training. I actually do find that sometimes it works okay. It's sort of hit or miss. This is a pretty diverse set of birds, so we'll see what happens with this data set. Got some small birds, got some big birds, birds on trees. So I won't actually pre-process this data set because I sort of already did it. Go ahead and hit close. So once you've got your data set in here, you want to pick whatever data set you're going to use. So I'm going to use this one. And you'll come over here and you'll click next. And now here's where we need to pick our training options or presets. This is where it's sort of like, I'll tell you what I think works best. And you can like decide if you want to follow that or not. So their preset here is like pick based on whatever describes your data set. This is not the way that I would do it. I would actually go ahead and click advanced. And then you've got type of architecture. You want to pick StyleGAN2. I just like flat out like pick StyleGAN2. StyleGAN1 trains faster, but it's like, I don't like the images as much. So I would just generally recommend StyleGAN1 for folks starting out. Then you're going to have the option here of a pre-trained model. And this is where it's kind of dependent on what you want to do size-wise. So if you click change here, you'll see there are a bunch of options here. So you can hover over this little eye, you'll sort of see what's here, right? So there is a churches model that is 256 by 256. There's a cars model that is 512 by 384. So I think, John, you were asking like, can I do non-square? You can, but the problem is you're limited then to these sizes. The cats model is 256 by 256. So again, like I wouldn't pick any of these because they're so small, whereas the faces one is 1024 by 1024. Now, one thing you'll also notice is like these are the model options they give you here, but because I've done all these other trainings, it also shows all of my other options here as well. So like when you want to do a continued training or like just pick up on where you started off, you can also go ahead and use this interface to pick additional options. Oh, interesting. So there's one on 1024 by 1024 that is botanical illustrations. That must be new. So I guess if you have botanical illustrations or other things that are like more animal-like or illustrated, you might want to pick this data set to train off of. I'm actually not going to do that because I want to show you how you get some weird stuff during transfer learning off of faces. So I'm going to pick faces for now. So the next step over here is to pick up on your training steps. So you'll go ahead and set your training steps. Now, for those of you who are not paying for creator plan just yet, I believe you'll be limited to 3,000 steps because this is like your free session. Once you've paid for a creator plan, you can update this. It doesn't really make sense to do anything other than steps of like thousands or 500. So I could do 6,000, I could do 5,000. Yeah. So you can sort of crank this up. I generally recommend for your very first training, if you've got a free training, you're just doing 3,000, like no questions asked. If you're paying and you just want to sort of see how a model turns out. I generally recommend about 5,000 steps. Now, it says 3 hours. I find this is off. It'll usually take about 5 or 6. I would usually say it's about an hour per 1,000 training steps. So just be aware that, like, you know, as you play with this, you're going to get a different length of time. You also notice there is another option here to do more pre-processing. So even though I didn't do the pre-process data step, I do have the option here of doing a random crop. I don't know what no crop does. I don't think that actually works the way they expect it to, or a center crop. Because all this stuff has been pre-cropped, it doesn't really matter. So I'll just leave it at center crop because it's just going to work the way I already uploaded the data set to. One other thing to note is that you can click here and see estimated costs. So this is, like, as I said, 5,000 steps is about $25. So you can sort of just like figure out what the cost is if you want to. So this is pretty much it, like, to get started. So are there any questions? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, back a little bit ago, you said because we're doing the free training that you recommended 3,000 steps. Could you go over why 3,000 versus 5,000?
Well, so basically, if you have a free training, you're limited to 3,000 steps. So I think you can't do anything more than 3,000.
Okay. Yeah.
The difference in training times is basically like, it's sort of like baking. It's like the longer you bake something for, in model training, like the more likely it is to look a little bit better. I'll also say, like, the way Runway does training steps is a little different than you might hear StyleGAN talked about outside Runway. So 5,000 steps is actually a pretty short period of time for overall training time. You'll get good results with it, but in general, like, I would actually say, like, if you want to train a model just like start to finish, I actually think 10,000 steps is actually a really the good way to go about it. But usually what I recommend is actually do 5,000 steps, see if you like the results. And if you do, like, you might do another 5,000 steps to actually get like it further baked. And I'll show an example of like baking or like how that works in just a minute. But yeah, basically if you have your free training, you're sort of stuck with 3,000. Once you pay for a creator plan, then you can like sort of crank up as much as you want.
So would you like train on top of the existing model, like an additional 5,000 steps then?
Yeah, so if you train for 3,000 steps and you like the result, or like you want to see if you can get it to be a little bit better, what you might want to do is, I'll show you an example there's a way to actually do this once you've trained it to continue your training, which sort of like jumps a couple of these steps, and you can train on top of that. So then you could sort of say, like, I've already trained this for 3,000 steps. I could train it for another 2,000 just to sort of see what it looks like at 5,000. I could train it for another 7,000 to see what it looks like at 10,000. It's sort of up to you. And we'll talk a little bit about how to pick the right steps in just a minute. But yeah, you can sort of like pick up and train from anything. Another cool technique that you might want to play with a little bit, and we'll talk about transfer learning in just a second, is you might want to pick up like from a different data set of your own, and you'll get these like weird in-between states. So I'm going to talk about transfer learning in just a minute. What I want to do is I'm just going to hit start training so that as I talk about transfer learning and other things, we can also come back and sort of see what's going on in the process. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start training. And it takes a couple minutes just to get up and running. It has to like do some stuff behind the scenes to get this up and running. So while this runs, let's talk a little bit about what transfer learning is and how it works and like that sort of thing. So transfer learning. So the step where you said pick what model you want to start from is a thing called transfer learning. And essentially what transfer learning is, again, it sort of picks up from a previous step or a previous model and sort of trains on top of it. So what you're going to see, and I'll show you where this sort of is exposed in just a minute. But when you start with faces, you're actually going to start like the first example of what you see will be faces, and you'll kind of be like, oh shit, did I do something wrong? And it's not just the transfer learning process. So transfer learning looks like this. So this is essentially this running, I don't know, 5,000 steps or whatever. So this is an image of every 500 steps as it trains. And so what you'll see here is the very first step is actually face. These are the face models that you will see, you know, in the faces example. And as you train a little bit further, you hit these sort of like creepy little like middle places where it's sort of like half your data set, half your half faces. All of you will get this. They will all be creepy and different in their own creepy way. But this is common. This is just what happens in the training process. It's basically sort of like unlearning the faces and relearning your data set. And the reason we use transfer learning is that to do this without transfer learning, it actually adds an additional like probably a day or two worth of training time, if not longer. And that's because this gets into like some really complicated stuff behind the scenes of how machine learning works. But essentially, we're using like this model, even though it's learned faces, has also learned a bunch of other stuff about just image generation in general. So I like to describe this as like learning a foreign language, right? So like if I've asked you, like I tell you like, okay, you have to go learn French. And then the way I test you is to say like, give me a French sentence. Like just giving me a single sentence doesn't describe everything you've learned about the whole like ecosystem of French. But I could easily take that sentence and translate it into another thing, right? So that's sort of what's going on here is like, even though this model is trained on faces, it's learned so much about making images that when I say like, hey, go learn how to make a different image, which is this like more geometric stuff, it still kind of knows how to do it. And it's just sort of like taking a different like process, or like takes a lot of the basics it learns about images and applies it to a new technique. So it saves us some time. And because all this stuff costs money, it also saves us money. So like, this is why we do transfer learning essentially. So you'll see again, like this goes through this very weird phase of where the initial sort of first hour or two is pretty weird and pretty freaky. And like, if you watch this over and over again, you'll sort of see how the faces dissolve into other things. But you can still sort of watch that, like when we reach this step, which is, you know, couple hours in, it looks very different, right? And we have very different images. And that's sort of what we want out of it, right? Like we eventually want it to look like the end step, but we have to get there. So that's just the thing about transfer learning. So just be aware that like, it is weird. It is kind of like freaky, or like some people really like those like in-between steps where like they've got weird images and they'll actually like use that as their own model, or like, you know, use that as a way to like create images from it. It's sort of up to you what you want to do with it. It's a cool little like side benefit of this transfer learning process. Any questions about that?
How do we record that process? Like, is it directly just given to us as part of?
Yeah, exactly. So this is still getting set up. So let me show you one of my other models that I trained previously. Let me see if I can find a good one. So let's actually use this one. If I come in here, oops, back to models. So we'll go down here and we'll go. So when you're finished training, this is what it's going to look like. It's just going to say like, hooray, you're done. I'll in a second, I'll show you where these steps are. But if you go back to training, you will actually get an interface like this while it's training. So as it like trains more and more, you'll see this like step counter sort of like build up and grow. And when you start at 0, it starts with faces. And as you scrub along this thing, you get different face types. And Runway gives you a really nice, cool thing, which is create progress video. So you just click this button, you'll get a progress video out of it. So that's like all I uploaded was just that progress video. So yeah, so Runway gives you a cool little fun thing here as a freebie. To do this without Runway would be a pain in the ass, but yeah.
Hey, Derek, if you were one of those people who desired the weirder middle ground,
yeah,
you then have to stop the training at that point, or can you go back?
You don't have to stop the training. I'm going to show you that in just a minute, how to actually like download those files or save them for yourself. But yeah, it's a little weird because Runway like both encourages it and discourages it. So I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. But yeah, you get essentially what you want to do is you just want to download those in-between steps, which you can do from here. Yeah, so this is sort of what's the process of all this trains. Let me just go back and see if my guy is set up in training here. In progress. Nope, still not set up here. Okay, well, while that gets running, I'll just still show you sort of where things are for me. Okay, so essentially as you're training, where did that go? So while you're training, this is going to just sort of like build up. So basically like for your very first time, I guarantee you'll sort of be glued to the computer and you'll just be like looking at it and you'll be scrubbing back and forth while it trains. It's cool. We all do it. It's totally fine. After like, you know, this is maybe my 20th training or whatever inside Runway, I've sort of just been like, I'm going to go to bed. I'll check it out in the morning. Like, I don't really worry about it that much. But yeah, it is cool. And it's fun to like sort of watch these train over time, right? So you'll be able to sort of like look at each of these. There is also a save sample image, so you can just like save out the actual image that you're looking at right now if you want to. Totally up to you. If you like really like these images or you like antsy to start sharing stuff, you can do that as well.
You got to pay for
so,
that?
No. So I think I give you this stuff for free. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Because you're paying for it. You just don't realize it, basically. Yeah. So essentially, like when a process is finished, you'll have 0 step all the way up to whatever step that you're training to, and you can just sort of scrub along and sort of check these out. Now, one thing to note is this isn't upload like every single. Like I don't think there's a change until like, I don't know, if you scrub like really small increments, it might not change that much. You scrub bigger increments, you'll definitely see some changes happen. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about some stuff that you can see here. So the first thing you'll notice is that as you scrub through these, you'll notice that like the faces last a relatively long period of time. Like you can still sort of see like where this face came from, even though it's almost gone now, like you can still sort of see it, right? So it takes up to like maybe 2,000 steps before it really feels like they're gone. And if you were to like keep watching it, it would get further and further away. So this is where, again, at 3,000 steps, let's look at where it is at 3,000 steps. So free training on this model would look like this, which is good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but you'll definitely see like the further along you get, if you were to look at the data set, you would see that this looks more like the data set. And so this is what we mean by baking or like training time, right? So like if I were to train this for only 3,000 steps, I would get something that like is still cool, right? There's still these abstract shapes, that sort of thing. But the further along I get, the more it's going to look like my other data set. And I should also add that like you can continue from this. So like up here at the top, there's a button that says continue training. So I actually trained this model for much, much longer. So if I come back over here, and I trained this for probably some like 20,000 steps in the long run. And if I go to training over here, you'll see by the end, this is looking very, very different than where I started, right? So I did this in 5,000 step increments or so. And you'll see that as it gets further and further trained, like this is now at like step 20,000 or something. It looks more and more like the data set. It looks more geometric. One thing to note is that like there's sort of like diminishing returns. So your first 5,000 steps or so will be like really big dramatic changes. And you'll be like, wow, that was totally worth it. Let me train it for another 10,000 steps and see how good it gets. And then it will like very, very slowly change over that period of time. You'll be like, man, that was a ripoff, like nothing changed. That is very common. It's just how this stuff works. And so again, it's sort of like how much money do you want to spend to get to like a really, really close approximation of like what you had versus do you want to save a little bit of money to just make some more slightly more abstract stuff? This is sort of the challenge of these things, right? Is you could spend $200 and the first $25 will give you like a really big change. And then next $175 will feel like it's like very barely changed, but just enough to make it feel like, oh, this is a better model. So this is sort of the problem with some of these things is just like the training time is exponential, like the very first steps are really good. And then it's really slow after that. And you'll be like, okay, this is working better, but not that much better. I don't know if it's worth it. So that's sort of the challenge of like, how long should I train this for? Which is why I usually say about 5,000 to 6,000 steps for your first training on a new model is good because it sort of gives you a good sense of how it works or how it doesn't work. So I'd say like, if you are training at like step 3,000 or 5,000 and you're not happy with it, continuing training is not going to make it like above and beyond better. It's just going to improve it slightly. So like if you're training on a model and you're really interested in realism and at step 4,000 or 5,000, you're not happy with it, don't continue training. Don't spend more money on it because it's like not really worth it because it really won't improve that much more. So just think about that. One thing I would also want to highlight is there's a thing here on the side that is called the FID score. As you train, this FID score will change. So at here it's 160. At here it's 161. At here it's 150. So what is FID score? So FID score is this like rather complicated machine learning idea of scoring these things and being like, how real is this? In the case of my images here, you'll see that this score really sucks. 150 is not a good score. A good score is something below 50. But the problem with FID scoring is it's based on sort of realism and photographic images. So like if you were to train these on faces, you would get a very low score over a certain period of time. So lots of people will often like look at their FID score and be like, oh, this model sucks because the FID score is bad. And that's not really how this works. So like, I would say like, look at the FID score just as like, is it getting better? Meaning, is the FID score getting lower? That's all you care about. Don't care about what the actual number is. Basically, but also like, it'll go up and down a little bit. So like, you know, it'll go up a little bit, then it'll go down a little bit, then it'll go up a little bit, then it'll go down a little bit. What you really want to do is like, over the length of your training time, has it gone down? And here you'll see it went down 10 points, which is not much. If you have more photographic stuff or more faces or other things that are more real, your score will probably dramatically go down from the start to end. It'll probably start at 200 and then go down to like 75 or 80 or 50 or something. So lots of people freak out about FID scores, and I would just say like, use it as like a general sort of like, how well is it doing, but don't worry about FID score. It's like a very complicated topic, and it's not always accurate depending on what you're training on. So just be aware of that. Let's see, what other notes here do I have for training while this runs a little bit longer. So we talk about transfer learning. Talk about FID scores. They don't really matter. Don't worry about them too much. Okay, so there's some things to watch out for. In most cases, you probably won't really need to worry about this. Runway has done a good job of sort of like watching out for these things and has built-in ways to avoid these. But there are some things that will happen sometimes during trainings, and I just want you to be aware of that. So first thing is called overfitting. Overfitting is essentially the idea that it memorized the images that you gave it. And there's some ways to tell if your model is overfitting or not. So yeah, essentially memorize the training set. So if you give it 50 images of different people, it just like sort of repeats those people back to you. This is usually what usually happens if your data set is too small, you will get overfitting. This is an example of a model I made that was like, I quickly grabbed like a bunch of computers or smartphones from Amazon, and I tried to train a model on this. And you'll see that it overfits because some of these images are repeated. And you see the sort of the same images over and over again, right? So these cell phones with this like background always show up the same way. This laptop or this TV or generally looking the same. I'm just like not really seeing a lot of difference or like new sort of images. Now, the really easy way to tell if something's overfitting is to do a morph for a latent interpolation. See how this one just bounces between images and there's really no like morphing between the shapes? That's a good sign that your model's overfitting. Whereas on the right here, like you'll see that this is like sort of smoothly interpolating between things. Whereas this one just sort of bounces between images. There's a little bit of change, but it's mostly just bouncing. Runway has done a good job because they know that most people are generating like low numbers of data set images, has done a way to sort of like massage around that a little bit. So most of you won't really see overfitting too much, but it does happen if you have a really, really small data. So that's sort of why I sort of have recommended like 500 as a good starting point. You can get away with like 100 or like 200, but it's pretty rare that you don't run into some level of overfitting. So just be aware of that. And again, like overfitting isn't terrible in terms of an art concept, right? It's like, it gives you cool, like little, like sort of like glitchy looking versions of the images you gave it, but it's maybe not a good use of your money, right? Like spending $25 to get the exact image back with like some pixelization isn't really like, I wouldn't be happy with that money. So again, like this is just sort of like, you might run into this and here's what happened. But just like in the end, it's like, it happens to all of us, but it's just something to be aware of. Usually the cause is that you don't have enough images in your data set or your images are too similar. So this is why I usually say like shoot for 500 because that's pretty good. This can also happen if your image data set has a lot of duplicates, right? So if you have like 500 images, but like 5 of them are like you've got 5 sets of pretty much the exact same images, it might also do that. So I find it happens less and less because a lot of these models have gotten good to like sort of avoid this, but it can happen. So just be aware of that. Also say this happens a lot more in StyleGAN1 than it is in StyleGAN2, which is again why I sort of recommend like clicking that advanced feature and going to StyleGAN2. Okay, mode collapse. So mode collapse is also a thing that happens. Mode collapse is it's kind of confusing to describe. Essentially what happens is it learns some images, but not all of your images. And it sort of like fixates on a couple images where it's just like sort of producing like, I don't know, just the same images over and over again. So let's say like, let's take Simpsons as an example, seems to be the theme of this class. If you were to give all of the Simpsons, like a bunch of Simpsons portraits to the model, so you've got Marge, you've got Bart, you've got Lisa, you've got Homer, you would expect to see the model sort of like produce Homer, Marge, blends, right? Or like these sort of things where like it's Homer with hair or whatever. If you're only seeing Homer in every single image you give it back, that's generally a sign of mode collapse. And this is something that does happen with pretty much all GANs. So again, if you go back to that idea of the bank forger, where like you're sending forged images to the bank teller, there's a case of where like the bank teller might always be able to tell what a dollar bill is, but not what a $100 bill is. So like the generator learns like, oh, I'll just fake it with always sending them a $1 bill rather than a $100 bill. That's kind of the concept behind what happens with mode collapse. Again, it shouldn't happen as much with Runway. They found some ways to work around that, but it might still happen. So just be aware of that. And I'll say like all mode collapse is generally common with GANs. So like if you have a very diverse data set, you will not always see the exact same, like, oh, I want to find this image in my data set. Like, where is it? Like, is it generating it out? There's always going to be a little bit of like smoothing and averaging of your data. So there will always be a little bit of what you might refer to as mode collapse, but it's just about how heavy of a mode collapse is it, right? So again, if it's only showing you Homer, that's bad. If it's showing you like all of the main Simpsons family, but not some of the side characters, that might be okay, right? So it's sort of like a little bit of a figure out how to like, how much is good and how much is bad. There's also a version of mode collapse that looks like this. Again, I don't think you'll see this with StyleGAN2, but you might see it with StyleGAN1, which is like mode collapse is not like, these aren't good images, but they're like sort of blurry, like weird noisy things. But again, this is a data set of all flowers. So like, but all these flowers look very similar in the sense of like, these two images look almost exactly the same. All the colors are sort of like muted to the brown and reds, and there's no purples or yellows or other things. So like this is an example of mode collapse where it's like also kind of like not even just the images in my data set. I've described this as mode collapse. There's also a thing called vanishing gradients, which might be what this is, or sorry, exploding gradients. Don't worry about that. But basically you might see an example of this where it's like all my images look like crap, but they all look like crap in the same way. So yeah. Again, these will also sometimes display in your interpolations or morphing videos where it just sort of jumps between, where it's not actually like sort of like smoothly interpolating between things. So just be aware of that. I would say again, like this is cool art, but it's not good GAN art, if that makes sense. Again, it's sort of a waste of my money. Like $50 on this I would be disappointed, but it can happen. So just be aware of that. If it does happen, Runway is not going to give you your money back because this is just a natural side effect of GANs. If it does happen to you, let me know and we can like figure out a way I'll help you out with doing another training or something. Again, I don't think this really happens that much. That's too commonly in StyleGAN, but it could happen. The only way to actually fix this is to retrain it. So just retrain from scratch. And unfortunately, that's the only way to fix it. Okay, so I'm just going to check here real quick and see if we're actually training stuff finally. Okay, cool. So here's an example of this model actually training in action. So at step 0, I've got all these faces, and you'll see them at step 300, which is very, very like not very far into my training steps. And you'll see that like what's sort of happening is like the background's getting whiter, right? Because my data set has a lot of white or paper background. So you'll see like it's sort of being obliterated. I might sort of get some bird textures in here a little bit later. But you also see my FID score is like 320, which is really, really high. Again, it's going to be bad for the first like 1,000 steps. This is definitely going to need to train for another couple hours. But just so you sort of see like here, I can't really go any further than 310. That's basically as far along as we've trained. So this is just going to keep training for a couple hours. And when it's done, I'll sort of be able to like see what it looks like. So in the case of where you've got a model that's actually finished, let's go to one of my cat examples here. So I'll just show you some different examples as we go through this. Oops, that's a wrong model. So this is a model of different cats. This one isn't really training or updating that often. Again, one of the questions is often like, how do I tell what step I want to work with? This is a bad example. Let me go back to a different one here. Let's use this one. What did this start with? Okay, I'm going to go back to that free GAN model that started with faces. Okay. So this one started with faces. You know, you might decide like, okay, what do I like these images? And this is a big challenge, is trying to figure out like, what step should I go? What step should I pick from? So we've got a couple slides here about how to actually go and decide this. So let's take an example of each of these steps right here. So we've got one at 2260, one at 2350, one at 2570. These are step counts, by the way, 2660. So a lot of times people will like show me their examples and they'll be like, I really like 2350 because I really like what's going on with this image here, right? And like, that's not how you want to pick out an example. So the first thing I recommend is don't look like steps don't look at steps where like it's every 100. So the first thing to note is that Runway only supports exporting or downloading your pickle files, which are the model files. Sorry, a pickle file is what you actually get out of this thing. It's called a .pkl file. It only supports downloading those from every 500 steps. So you can't even get like, there's no difference between these two models in terms of how Runway looks at it. There's a difference between 2570 and 3000 or 3000 and 4000. So don't try to like judge within this very narrow space. You want to sort of look at a broader range of images. Yeah, so don't do this. So what I recommend doing is looking at just about every 1,000 steps or maybe like every 500 or so. And here's a better example of how you might go about deciding like which of these models is better, or which one of these is like good, or which one do I want to work from. So you'll see 900 here. There's still maybe some faces, but this is very noisy. It's very like wavy and stuff. Whereas if I look at 5,000, I'll see some more of my like sort of more geometric shapes that are more centered and like more structurally sound or geometric. So this is how I would go about deciding what step you want to work from, or what example you want to work from. So it's sort of like, do I like 9,000? Do I like 2,000? Do I like 4,000? Do I like 5,000? So again, don't like try to like guess between these increments. Another thing to remember is that you know, this is a grid of what, maybe this is 4 by 6. So these are 24 images out of an infinite number of images in your data set. So like, do not, like, I really don't recommend like being like, oh, I really like this image, so therefore that means the whole data set or the whole like training in this step is good, right? Like sort of look at them overall. Like, again, this one's like got a lot of interesting textures, but it's not as like structural or like geometric. Whereas this one's more geometric, more stuff focused in the center, that sort of thing. So it's sort of like, which of these do I want? Whereas then in the middle here, like I've got these sort of middle ones where like there's a little bit more of shapes in addition to textures. It's sort of a good mix. So maybe it's like, maybe I want to go with this one because there's a little bit more diversity in terms of what I would get out of those shapes. So that's where it's really, really important to remember with training your data set is that like, or like in your training is like, don't overthink the individual steps. Just sort of like look at what you've got between each of these. So just remember that. I definitely recommend keeping that in mind. And yeah, just remember that all these images here are samples. Like, so if you're like, oh, I'm not seeing a Marge photo in these, that might be an example of maybe it's mode collapse, or maybe it's just like there's a Marge photo in this data set and it just didn't happen to get shown in the samples. So just be aware of that. Like, this is sort of one of the challenges of just like, you sort of learn this intuitively over like a couple training sessions. You sort of get a sense of like how it works and how it doesn't. But this is just to sort of help you like in your first couple trainings. Okay, so
Derek, quick
challenge
question.
here.
Are
Yeah,
you
go for it.
able to change the sample that you're looking at in Runway? Like, are you able to kind of like how you can change the vector, change the sample that it's pulling from?
You can't in training. So in training, these are fixed. And the reason they do that is it's helpful to sort of see how things change over time, right? So like, I can sort of see like between these two steps, like how, like, let's take a look at this pink one up here in the top left. I can sort of just watch how it changes over time. And that's the key, is I want to sort of see how it's training over time.
Right.
So you can't do it in here. One thing to note is you could generate these in your like in the Runway vector interface and sort of see what different types of diverse images you get. So one thing I want to note here is when you're finished training, so let me just pull up my latest training here. I'm going to go to training. Actually, I'm going to go to review. So when you're finished here, your model will be finished training. You can go to add to your workspace. And when you add this to your workspace, you can then go ahead and use this just like you would any other Runway model, right? So I'm going to switch to vector. I'll start this running. This is just going to take a minute. So while this runs, you can go ahead and like, play with the truncation values, play with the sampling distance. So you actually view your model in that space. Now, one thing I note is by default, Runway will pick the last steps of your training session. So if you trained it for 5,000 steps, it will just show you what 5,000 looks like. The way to change that is in train. If you go to here, you go to selected checkpoint, you can change. You can change your steps. So here is where you change to whatever you want your default to be. So right now by default, it's always the last one. So it's like, in this case, step 6,000. If I wanted one of those earlier steps, like say I wanted something that was a little bit more colorful, I could go back and I could set the default to be 1,000. So if you click here and you click on set as default, it will change your default value to be step 1,000. So then you can go and add it to your model and view it there. Now, one thing I really want to note about this is that there's a big message here that says you only have 14 days to select your default checkpoint. So after 14 days, they will delete all of the checkpoint files that are not the one you picked by default. So in this case, if I left this, I think I've trained this maybe 2 weeks ago. If I left this as this for another day or two, it would delete all my other files and just save this one. So that's good, but sometimes it's bad. So like one thing you might want to do is like, if you actually like a couple of these different checkpoints, you want to download these files. And the way to download these files is again, to click on this, whatever step you're looking at, click the little ellipses menu and then hit download. And then you'll be asked like, where do you want to download to? So hit save. So again, I don't necessarily recommend like going in and saving every single step. Maybe pick out a couple of the steps, or like maybe pick every 1,000 or every 2,000 you like, and just save those. I probably won't cover it in this class. I'll cover it next week if someone reminds me, but I'll show you how to re-upload these models into a custom data set. So that way you can actually like reuse it multiple times. Because when you load this by default, it's only going to show whatever your default is. So just be aware of that. And again, you only have 2 weeks to actually like download these files. So make sure you do that. I'll be honest, I actually probably don't save most of my models at this point beyond just whatever it's just with. But maybe just when you're experimenting and playing, you might want to download these. And just know these files are pretty large. They're about 370 megabytes. So if you download every single step, like you will have a couple of gigabytes of files. So again, be judicious about what you save and what you don't save. So I've got this, let's see if this is loading up in my models here, model workspace. Cool, so this one is now loaded up. So you'll see that I can actually go ahead and I can use this just like anything else in this interface. So this is pretty much it for training. Are there any questions?
When we download the pickle files, does it automatically tell us which step, or do we have to like rename that ourselves?
That's a good question. I think it does tell you what step. Oh, okay. Interesting. It might not, it might, I think the case there is that it's the last step. So I think it just names it that. Let me go back to train. Let's look at this again. Actually, I'm going to set this as my default. So I think if you go and click download, I think you can name it. So that's the deal, is like, I would recommend when you do the saving, name your file with however many steps it is. So this is 4,000. That way you just remember. It is helpful to do that. Yeah.
For sure. And then, so you mentioned in the presentation before training that we should check in on it every hour or so. Is that like, so it doesn't, if something like crashes, we can just like scrap the run, but Runway refunds us money if the run doesn't go, right? So we could technically like run it overnight.
Yeah, so that's generally what I do. I'll just run stuff overnight. I just think like for your first time, it's helpful to just sort of like look at it and see what's going on. But yeah, realistically, like I don't really check these that often. I might check them in the middle of a step. There is a way to hit stop. I think if you hit stop, they'll be refunded for any time you didn't do training. So if this like only made it to step 500 and you hit stop, I think you'll be refunded, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So, I wouldn't test that. Is basically what I'm saying. Unless you like know there's a problem, or like you realize you upload the wrong data set, or like it's just somebody's like really not looking right. Like also I'd say like your very first couple steps, like up to like step 1,000 when you train from a face model, like don't stop it until you hit maybe 2,000 steps because it's just not worth it. Like it's gonna look weird for the first like couple hours, no matter what. But yeah, I would just definitely say like don't hit stop unless you really, really definitely want to stop it and you don't mind
Okay.
throwing away your money. I think they refund you, but like don't hold me to that.
Sounds good.
Any other questions? Cool. Okay, so I want to show you, we've got like 20 minutes left, so I want to show you a couple other cool things you can do. Because some of you will like probably tonight, like start training your model and you'll be really excited and you want to play with it. So I'm going to show you some cool things you can play with within Runway right now. So when you're finished, oops, this one's still training. So let me go to one of my finished models. Let's go to this one. So when you're finished, on this review page, the first thing you do is they give you a cool little video of your model that's morphing. So this is, Steve, this one's free. So you can go ahead and click save video and you will get at least one video that is like a cool morph. So this again, like just download it and you can save it and it'll be cool. So you can go ahead and save this video. So they will give you like just sort of like one sort of like, hey, this is a latent space walk video that is cool. You can also from here generate a bunch of static images. So again, remember how I said in the model workspace, you've got this interface and you could just use it just like you would any other model tool. Like go ahead and just download. Oh, I don't want to save vectors. I'm going to save the image. So you could like go ahead and like save out some images. You could play with sampling distance. Oh, you can't do 100. That's 1.0. So be like, oh, this one's cool. Like let me do this one. Okay, whatever. That's fine. So you can do this one by one if you wanted to. Now there's two ways to do like bulk exports. The first one was from that final page interface where it said there was like a way to, let's go back there and doing a lot of jumping around. Sorry, I hope that you're able to follow and it's not too chaotic. From here, you can also generate images. So you could generate 100 images that are just randomly generated from this if you wanted to. And that will cost you $1. So when you do this like sort of bulk image generation, when you do a bulk image generation, it's going to be 1 cent per image. So this is cheaper than like probably digging around and like generating by hand, 100 images. It's probably going to take you longer than like 20 minutes or whatever. So you can just do a bulk generation. Now, the downside of doing bulk generation is you just get the images. You don't get what vectors those are. So like if you want to go and we'll show you some stuff how to do like vector interpolation, that sort of stuff next week. Bulk might not be good, but this is just a cool way to just generate lots of images. You can like dig through and sort of see what's cool or what's not. So this is the place where you can generate bulk images. Now you can also do it from the model workspace. In model workspace, there is this tab here called export. So there's a thing called preview and there's a thing called export. When you switch to export, this takes a little bit of time.
They have a latent walk space as well here. Is that cheaper than, or it's more expensive than if we did it by P5JS?
So once this loads, I'll be able to describe this a little bit better. So this is a pretty newish interface. I think Runway added this maybe a month or two ago. You can generate your own latent walks and you can also generate your own static images from here. What's cool about this is that the latent walk you'll sort of have a little bit more control than you would. Well, previously they used to do just like an auto export that was like almost randomly generated. What's going on here? Let's figure out what's going on.
And then while that's loading, is that similar to like when we're playing with the vectors, it's still pinging the machine, so we're being charged per second as we're playing with where we want to start the latent walk?
Yeah, so the cool thing about exports is exports charge based on how long or how many frames you're generating. So this is outside of the interface of like how much time you're spending. So this cost, like right now, so we've got this interface here where like, it's kind of a nice interface, actually. They added this very, very recently, maybe a month or two ago, where you can actually like generate your interpolation using this. So you can actually go ahead and click on these images and you're at sort of like, here's what I want to generate like step by step. So let's do this one and let's add another one and we'll do this one instead. Oops, what happened there? Delete that one. Cool. So this is a way We'll talk about next week about why P5JS might be better for certain things, but this is a way to just generate some morphs directly inside a Runway if you want to. So the way this is working is basically I've got my steps here. So I've got a cool, like I'm going to go from this image to this image to this image to this image. And you'll see here I want 15 seconds between each of these. I personally find that to be a little high. I would generally do looking at like 5 seconds between each of these steps. It's going to be really slow if you do 15 seconds. What's also cool here, and this is something you don't get in P5JS, is you can sort of look at like how you want to like your easing curves. So you can have like a very linear movement. You can have it sort of go slow and then fast and then slow. There's different ways to generate your morphs, your interpolations here. So what's cool is like you've got some just your like, these are your interpolation points, and then you can interpolate between them. You can also save some of these. So if you really like some of these images, you can save out an image, and then when you come back to it, it'll like be in this starred category, which you could then come back to and sort of be like, I want to pick from some of my favorites. So this is, I guess there's 4 different points and there's 5 seconds between each of them. So this is gonna be a 15-second video. And if you want to estimate your cost here, you will see that this is gonna cost 50 cents. So during a video, 50 cents, I mean, it's not terrible. And so basically, no, it's not bad. You can play with truncation value here, right? So if you want to like set the truncation value to be smaller, just know that when you change the truncation value, the images change as well. So what I've got set up here is actually going to be different. This is a bug in Runway where they don't actually update these images. They update these images, but they don't update these. So now that I've changed this to 0.7, it's not actually going to be the same images. So I probably want to set this back to 0.8 just because I know that it's going to look like these. You also have controls around video frame rate. So if you're like really into how long your video frame rate, those sort of things, you can play with this. So like I usually set it to 24 for various reasons. You've got some options here. I think if you set your frame rate to be lower, well, this one is, so there's like there's a threshold for like, basically the cost is at minimum going to be 50 cents. The longer or the longer you make your videos, like the higher the cost will get. So like if I set this to be like, let's say 20 seconds between each of these, and I do estimated cost. Yeah, you'll see it's now $1.44. So it's always going to cost at bare minimum 50 cents per export. So just be aware of that. Like if you're doing a really short video, you might not actually want to do that because it's going to be kind of expensive. But if you go really long or whatever, you could add, the thing you can add, like, I don't even know how many of these points you can add. You can add a lot of different points here. And as you do this, these are adding in random ones, but you could also like, again, like sort of say that at this point, I want it to be this one. At this point, I want it to be this one. So you can sort of play with this. So this is a cool interface. I definitely recommend, like, if you just want to make some cool morphs, like play with it here. The P5JS stuff will give us more control, and we're going to do some different things. So like next week, we're going to look at how to generate an almost totally random morph that loops back on itself. So that'll be like, so you can actually do this where, let's say I want this image. See, here's the challenge is I think I've lost that image. So I can't actually like, to loop, right, I need to go back to that very last point. So what I could do is if it was a starred image, I could add that last point as my starred, right? So I could make loops here. It's a little bit of a challenge. In P5JS, it's much easier. Like it's way easier to just sort of like say like loop back to where you started. You could generate like a really cool like looping animation though. So for P5JS, we're going to look at how to do that using like almost randomness. We'll look at how to duplicate this interface in P5JS, which won't be as fun. We'll look at some other different ways of doing morphs, and then we'll also do an example that is audio generative. So basically you'll upload an audio sample, and we'll have the audio like sort of move based on, we'll have the images move based on the audio, the volume of the track. So we'll do some cool stuff with that that you can't do inside Runway. So it's sort of like some things like if you just want to make morphs, Runway is fine. If you want to do some more interactive stuff, like you might want to play with P5JS. So from here, you can export this video, just click export. This is actually going to move you to your assets folder. And then it's going to like, basically there's going to be a process that runs. And when this is done, you'll be able to download the video from here. I go back to my model workspace, go to export again. So that's a way to do morphs just right within Runway. You can also, if you just want to generate random images, there is a generate images tab over here. And this will allow you to generate however many images you want, right? So I could generate 500 images. You will want to set the truncation value. Again, remember these are random, so you don't really get to see what they look like before they're generated. It's still fun, just as like a way to just like dump a bunch of stuff out, just sort of see what you get. But you have less control over this. So less control, but maybe a little bit cheaper. That's sort of that's the trade-off there. And here again, if you just hit export images, we'll export those to your assets folder. And you can look at the price here. So again, remember that during 500 images at 1 cent per image is going to cost you $5. So just be aware of that. I probably won't do that. I don't generally a lot of random images just because I tend to find I like a little bit more control over those. So instead of assets, let's see what's going on here. Yeah, so see, this is in progress of sharing our interpolation video. And, you know, when it hits 100%, you'll be able to download it. Were there questions?
Two questions. Truncation, just to refresh me, is the distance between the vectors, right? So like the closer to the left side of the slider bar you are, the shorter the hops are, versus the other side closer to 1 gets you like further jumping between the latent space.
That's kind of one way to think about it. The way I think about it is the smaller, the closer you are to 0, the more likely your images are going to look real, or like closest to your data set. The downside is you get less diverse images. So if you actually set it to 0, you will get the exact same image over and over and over again. Most people set it to about 0.5 to 0.8, and that will get you a good representation of images that look like your data set but are diverse. If you set it to 1.0, you can actually set it higher than that, but most people don't. If you set to like 1.0, you will get a lot more images, but those images will tend to look a little bit weirder or less representative of what yours in your data set.
Okay, thanks.
You had another question, is that right?
Oh, I think I forgot it.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. So let's check in on our training here and see how we're going. Cool. So now up to 710. So see, like now I've got little stick figure guys, right? You can actually see the faces here, right? The faces are still sort of like being obliterated. But now apparently the way this model has determined is that your eyes, like your eye sockets and glasses and your eyebrows are becoming birds. So it's kind of fun to watch this. I won't lie. It's pretty interesting to sort of see how this happens. Again, another hour or two, I will probably have no faces and just have the starts of birds and some bird textures. But again, this is a pretty small data set, so I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. I'll share it with the group when it's finished. We'll sort of see how it goes. But yeah, so, you know, you'll come back to this, you know, just keep like sort of checking on it as it goes. So that was a big deep dive into training. Are there any other questions or anything else I can help folks with? So I'll say like this was the hour-long demo. And obviously like we went into some depth into certain areas. If you're interested in just sort of like, maybe you're still finishing up your data set and next week you like want to start training, you're like, I do not want to watch an hour of him walking through all these steps. There is that shorter video included in the deck, which I'll make sure I'll link to the deck for our class, and you can just sort of watch that video. I think that video is, what is that? That's probably like a 20-minute long video. So let's go back on. There we go. One thing I note is that this interface is a little out of date. So you might see slightly different things here than you would see in your other version, but it's like the concepts are still the same. So if you get tripped up at all, just like hit me up on Slack or over email, and I'll sort of walk you through what changed or what didn't. But yeah, this will sort of walk you through those steps. So in general, like you might find this one more helpful than this class, but if you still want to remember everything or just like walk through like what was the difference in transfer learning or how did that work, like you can watch those as well. Cool. So again, like your homework sort of like for the next week is, it'd definitely be a good idea to have at least one training for next week. That way you can sort of follow along and figure out how to do some of the P5 stuff. So next week we will be looking at like how to do more cooler interpolations. I've got a bunch of demos that I'll just share with people. It's just a folder of like different examples of P5.js stuff. So we'll look at how to generate like sort of a random walk, a random interpolation that loops. We'll look at how to do the stuff similar to what's in Runway. We'll look at an audio generation example, and then I'll probably have I want to do another single like morph type that will allow you to do different things. So basically it'll be different tools and different ways in which to generate different interpolations using some other tools inside of P5. Yeah, go for it.
You said you should do at least one training. Does it happen where you do multiple trainings for the same data set? Like, do you go back in and edit the data set and then retrain that model? Is that kind of how it all works, or is you just
Yeah, that's certainly something you can do. It's sort of like if you're like, oh, maybe I need more data to get a better representation of these images, or, oh, it turns out like in your case with bus, it's like, oh, I should just find just images with white backgrounds. So maybe you go and find more of that and you want to train those. So one thing to do, and this is a great point, I should have really mentioned this. The way to pick up on a training from a previous session is there's sort of two ways to do it. Is one, you could go from train, you could just click on generate images, create, and you could upload a different data set. And when you upload a different data set, you can then go to next. And then in advanced here, if you go down here and you go to change pre-trained model, you'll go to like the model you've already trained, right? So here's birds. So I can actually go and like pick up from this one. The other like slightly quicker way to do that is from your training session in CGS. At the top here is the thing called continue training. If you click this.
Derek, I don't think you're sharing screen.
Ah, thank you. So bad at this. Okay, let me restart that. Okay, so there's two places to pick up a training session from. The first is from this interface. You can just go ahead and click train again. So you just will like, let's say this like, let's call this like, I don't know, Met V2. And you just go hit create. And then you would either upload a new data set or pick the previous data set that you already trained from. And then you would go to next and then click on advanced here and then go down here and change. And you'll pick the model you already trained from. So you could pick like this. And then you would basically train on top of that. So if you change your data set, you still want to train off this, right? Because it's still like the most well-learned of that. And you pick up from there. Now, the easier place to do this from, this is one way to do it if you just like sort of forget. An easier way to do this is actually from the finished version of your training set. So if you go to here, and this is the finished version of this trained model. At the top here is something that says continue training. If you click this and then like rename this like CGS V2 and then continue, it's going to automatically jump you like all the way ahead to like where you need to be. Now this works well if you just want to pick up and train for a longer period of time from your previous data set. The challenge here is that like this is already pre-picked the previous data set. So if you want to change your data set, you probably want to go through the other process. But if you just want to like train this for a longer period of time, just clicking that continue training will jump you ahead to say like, how much longer do you want to train this for using the exact same data set and the exact same settings as before.
Great.
Cool. Any other questions? All right, well, that wraps up this week. So hopefully you can get to training a model starting next week or starting this week. Again, if you have questions or if you're like, I totally missed some steps that you showed me, can you help me out? I'm happy to jump on a Zoom like for 10 minutes and just walk you through things again. So, you know, watch the videos or just try again. And if you still have questions, like please feel free to like hit me up and we can walk through it. And hopefully, again, you don't really need a model by next week, but it's probably good to just like at least try it. And then if you run into issues, we can help debug. Cool. All right. I will see everybody next week then.
Thanks, Derek.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.